The crystal champagne glass exploded against the marble floor of the Shilla Hotel's golden ballroom as Yoon Sora's manicured hand connected with Malika Davenport's face. The crack echoed through the silence like a gunshot, freezing every conversation among Seoul's 30 most powerful business moguls. "Know your place," Sora hissed in broken English, her voice dripping with the entitled venom of old money. "People like you should be grateful to even breathe the same air as us." The racist slur that followed made several guests gasp, their designer suits suddenly feeling too tight. Malika didn't flinch. Her wine-colored Armani suit remained immaculate, her golden signet ring catching the chandelier light as she slowly turned her head back to face her attacker. The red mark blooming across her dark cheek only made her smile more terrifying. "People like me?" Malika's voice was silk wrapped around steel. She adjusted her blazer with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to project absolute control. "Mrs. Park, you just made the most expensive mistake in Korean corporate history." The ballroom held its breath. Park Minjun rushed forward, his Patek Philippe watch trembling on his wrist as sweat beaded his forehead. "Please, there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." Malika's eyes never left Sora's face. "Your wife just declared war on someone who owns 60% of the companies that keep your electronics empire alive." She pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "David, cancel every contract with Minjun Electronics. All of them. Effective immediately." Sora's confident smirk faltered. "You're bluffing. You're just some American nobody." "Am I?" Malika's laugh was ice cold. She turned to address the room, her voice carrying to every corner. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to properly introduce myself. I am Malika Davenport, founder and CEO of Davenport Industries. Perhaps you know us better as the primary investors in Samsung's overseas expansion, LG's African markets, and the financial backbone of half the companies represented in this room tonight." The silence was deafening. Minjun's face had gone ashen. "You have 72 hours to decide how you want to apologize, Mrs. Park. After that, I stop playing nice." Malika placed her champagne glass on the nearest table, untouched. "And trust me, you don't want to see what happens when the most feared woman in American business stops playing nice. Most of our listeners aren't subscribed to our channel yet, but stories like this one, where justice meets power in the most unexpected ways, are exactly why we pour our hearts into creating these narratives. If you want to hear more tales of consequence and redemption, hit that subscribe button to encourage us to keep bringing you these powerful stories. Now, let's see what happens when someone finally faces the real price of their prejudice. The Shilla Hotel's valet still held the door as Malika Davenport stepped into the Seoul night, her heels clicking against the marble with military precision. Behind her, the golden ballroom buzzed with whispered panic and the desperate sound of damage control. David Chen appeared at her side within seconds, his tablet already glowing with urgent notifications. "The contracts are being terminated as we speak," he reported quietly. "Legal estimates Minjun Electronics will lose approximately $40 million in guaranteed revenue within the first week." "Just the beginning," Malika replied, sliding into the back of her black Mercedes. The leather seats were warm, the interior a sanctuary of quiet power. "What's our total exposure to their supply chain?" David's fingers flew across his screen. "We control their primary component suppliers in Vietnam, their shipping contracts through Dubai, and their North American distribution network. If we pull everything..." He paused, calculating. "They'll lose $320 million in the first quarter alone." The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as they drove through Gangnam, the neon signs reflecting off glass towers like digital prayers to capitalism. Each building represented someone's empire, someone's dreams built on the backs of others. And their debt structure? Malika asked, her voice conversational despite the gravity of what they were orchestrating. Highly leveraged. Bank loans secured against future contracts we just canceled. The domino effect should reach their creditors by tomorrow morning. David looked up from his tablet. Malika, this will destroy them. Are you certain? Am I certain that racism should have consequences? She touched the tender spot on her cheek where Sohra's hand had connected. Some lessons can only be learned through financial ruin, David. They built their fortune on the assumption that people like me would stay silent, stay grateful, stay invisible. The Mercedes turned onto the street leading to the Four Seasons, where Malika's penthouse suite waited. But tonight, sleep would be impossible. Tonight was for strategy, for precision, for showing the world what happened when someone made the fatal mistake of underestimating Malika Davenport. David's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Park Minjun is trying to reach you. 7 missed calls in the last 15 minutes. Let him wait, Malika said, watching Seoul's skyline scroll past. Fear makes better decisions than pride. By morning, he'll understand exactly who he allowed his wife to attack. The car pulled into the hotel's underground garage, where security waited to escort them to the private elevator. As the doors closed, Malika caught her reflection in the polished steel, composed, dangerous, and absolutely unstoppable. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. But tonight belonged to the woman who had just signed the death warrant of an empire with nothing more than a phone call and the quiet promise of justice. The sun had barely touched Seoul's skyline when Park Minjun's phone exploded with notifications. His corner office on the 42nd floor of the Minjun Electronics building suddenly felt like a trap, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of a city that no longer seemed to belong to him. Sir, we have a problem. His assistant's voice trembled as she placed a stack of termination notices on his mahogany desk. 17 major suppliers have canceled their contracts. The shipping company in Dubai won't take our calls. And North American Distribution Corp just sent this. Minjun's hands shook as he read the notice. Immediate termination. Breach of ethical standards. No appeal process. His empire, built over 2 decades, was crumbling in real time. Across the city, Malika sat in her hotel suite's dining room, methodically working through her morning routine. Fresh orchids on the table. Coffee from Ethiopian beans she'd personally selected. The Wall Street Journal and Financial Times spread beside her iPad, which showed Minjun Electronics' stock price in freefall. The Seoul Exchange opened down 38%, David reported, settling into the chair across from her. Trading volume is 10 times normal. The financial press is calling it a mystery sell-off, but the smart money knows exactly what's happening. Malika nodded, cutting into her perfectly prepared eggs Benedict. And Mrs. Park? Locked herself in their penthouse apartment. 16 missed calls to her husband. 43 to her mother-in-law. Park Ji-hwan isn't taking her calls. David scrolled through his intelligence reports. The old woman is furious. Apparently, she's been waiting years for an excuse to exile Sohra from the family. The morning news played silently on the wall-mounted screen, showing footage of Minjun Electronics headquarters. Reporters clustered outside like vultures, their cameras capturing every executive who fled the building with boxes in their arms. How long do you estimate before they break? Malika asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. Minjun will crack within 48 hours. He's too proud to beg immediately, but the financial pressure will overwhelm him. Sohra... David paused. Sohra doesn't understand the gravity yet. She thinks this is temporary embarrassment, not permanent destruction. Malika's phone buzzed. Another call from Minjun. She declined it without looking. The movement as automatic as breathing. Power was about timing, and she hadn't finished teaching her lesson yet. "Schedule a meeting with Lee Sang-woo from the Korea Business Daily," she instructed. "It's time the press understood the full scope of what happened last night. Let them dig into the Park family's finances, their ethical violations, their treatment of employees." The city spread below them like a game board, each building a piece in the elaborate strategy Malika had spent 20 years perfecting. She'd learned that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be taken, one calculated move at a time. By evening, Minjun Electronics would be hemorrhaging money. By tomorrow, their credit lines would be frozen. And by the end of her 72-hour deadline, Park Minjun would understand that some mistakes could never be undone, only paid for in the currency of absolute humiliation. Lee Sang-woo had seen corporate titans fall before, but never with the surgical precision he was witnessing at the Four Seasons Hotel. Malika Davenport sat across from him in her suite's living room, her presence commanding even in the midst of orchestrating someone's destruction. "You want to know who I really am," she said, not asking, but stating. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, the gesture almost hypnotic. "Most people think power comes from being born into the right family, attending the right schools, marrying the right person." Sang-woo's digital recorder captured every word while his photographer documented the woman who had just brought a chaebol to its knees in less than 24 hours. "I was 8 when my mother abandoned me at a Detroit bus station," Malika continued, her voice steady despite the devastating revelation. 15 when I started working 3 jobs to put myself through high school. 22 when I borrowed $5,000 to start what would become Davenport Industries." The morning sun painted golden rectangles across the marble floor as she spoke, her wine-colored blazer immaculate despite the early hour. "By 25, I owned my first factory. By 30, I was manufacturing components for electronics companies worldwide. By 35, I was the silent partner behind half the Korean tech industry's overseas expansion." Sang-woo's pen flew across his notebook. This wasn't just a story about corporate retaliation. This was the exposure of a shadow empire that had been operating in plain sight for years. "The irony," Malika said, standing to gaze out at Seoul's sprawling metropolis, "is that Minjun Electronics has been dependent on my factories for over a decade. Every smartphone, every tablet, every smart TV they've exported to Africa and South America, built with components from companies I own." Her reflection in the window was sharp, predatory. So when his wife decided to put me in what she thought was my place, she was actually attacking the woman who had been keeping their entire empire afloat. David Chen entered silently, placing a fresh intelligence report beside Malika's coffee. The pages detailed the Park family's mounting desperation, emergency board meetings, desperate calls to government contacts, frantic attempts to secure bridge loans from competitors. "The beauty of building power in shadows," Malika explained to Sang-woo, "is that people underestimate you until it's too late. They see a black woman and assume limitation. They hear an American accent and assume naivety about Korean business culture." She turned back to face the journalist, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "But I've been studying chaebol structures since I was 25. I know about the cross-holding, the family dynamics, the government relationships. I know that Minjun owes $2 billion to Chinese financial cartels, secured against contracts I just canceled." Sang-woo felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just corporate warfare. This was a master class in strategic demolition. "You want to know why they call me the most feared woman in American business?" Malika asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because when someone makes the mistake of judging me by my skin color instead of my bank account, I don't just destroy them. I make them grateful for whatever scraps of dignity I leave behind." The interview would run in tomorrow's paper, But Sang-woo already knew he was documenting the final hours of the Park family's reign. In a world where reputation was currency, Malika Davenport had just declared financial war, and she never lost. The Seoul Stock Exchange opened to chaos. Minjun Electronics' share price plummeted 43% in the first hour of trading, wiping out $2 billion in market value before most executives had finished their morning coffee. In the emergency boardroom of Minjun Electronics, 27 men in identical dark suits stared at the red numbers cascading across multiple screens. The silence was broken only by the sound of phones buzzing with margin calls and the occasional curse muttered in Korean. "Explain this to me," demanded Director Kim, his face flushed with panic. "Yesterday we were negotiating expansion into Southeast Asia. Today our stock is in freefall, and half our suppliers won't return our calls." Minjun loosened his tie, the silk noose suddenly unbearable around his throat. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, surviving on adrenaline and the false hope that somehow this nightmare would reverse itself. "It's that American woman," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "The one Soh. He couldn't bring himself to say the words that had triggered this avalanche. "She controls more of our supply chain than we realized." Across the city, Malika stood in the Davenport Industries Seoul office, a modest operation that masked its true influence. The space occupied 2 floors of a glass tower in Gangnam, its understated elegance reflecting the quiet power of its owner. "Trading volume is 15 times normal," reported her market analyst. "Institutional investors are fleeing. The pension funds started dumping their positions 20 minutes after open." David approached with updates from their network of contacts throughout Korean business circles. The Bank of Korea received 3 separate requests for emergency loans. All declined. The China Development Bank is asking questions about the collateral securing Minjun's existing debt. Malika nodded, studying the real-time data streaming across her screens. 20 years of careful relationship building had created a web of influence that stretched from Lagos to Jakarta, from Detroit to Dubai. When she decided to flex that power, entire markets responded. "What's the family situation?" she asked, her voice clinical despite the human drama unfolding. "Soh hasn't left their penthouse since yesterday. She's been calling fashion boutiques, apparently planning to shop her way through the crisis. Minjun's mother has cut off all communication. The old woman is meeting with lawyers about protecting the family's remaining assets." The morning sun painted harsh shadows across the trading floor, visible through the windows below. Each blinking screen represented someone's fortune being redistributed, someone's dreams being transferred from one column to another in the vast ledger of capitalism. "How long before the cascade effect reaches their government contracts?" Malika asked. "The Ministry of Science and Technology is reviewing all existing agreements. National security clauses allow for immediate suspension if a contractor's financial stability comes into question." David's smile was grim. "They'll trigger those clauses by end of week." Minjun's empire was dying in real time, hemorrhaging value and credibility with each passing hour. But for Malika, this was simply the market correcting an imbalance, the price of assuming that power belonged only to those born into it, that respect was inherited rather than earned. The war was far from over, but the first battle belonged to the woman who understood that in the modern economy, true power wasn't measured in bloodlines or skin color. It was calculated in influence, leverage, and the willingness to use both without mercy. The private investigator's report landed on Malika's desk at exactly 3:47 p.m., its contents more devastating than even she had anticipated. Yoon Sora's carefully constructed biography was a house of cards, and Malika was about to light the match. "Her university degree is completely fabricated," David reported, flipping through pages of documented evidence. The University of Southern California has no record of her attendance. The diploma hanging in their penthouse apartment was purchased from a document forger in Itaewon. Malika leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly as she processed this information. The Seoul skyline stretched beyond her office windows, each glass tower a monument to the kind of ambition that destroyed people who cut corners. "What else?" she asked, though the question was rhetorical. In her experience, fabricated credentials were never isolated lies. They were symptoms of a deeper rot. 5 years as a hostess in Gangnam clubs before she met Minjun. The employment records are buried, but our contact at the taxation office found the income reports. She was pulling in approximately $40,000 a year serving drinks to businessmen and politicians. The irony was delicious. Sohra had built her identity around superiority and breeding, looking down on others while her own past was a construction of desperation and calculated social climbing. Malika's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Lee Sang-woo. The journalist had been busy since their interview, following leads with the tenacity that had made him Seoul's most feared investigative reporter. "I need confirmation," Sang-woo said without preamble. "The degree fraud, the hostess background, the falsified employment history. Are you planning to make this public?" "Justice requires truth," Malika replied, her voice measured. "The Korean public deserves to know what kind of person feels entitled to judge others based on race while hiding her own fabricated past." Through her window, she could see the Minjun electronics building 12 blocks away, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun like a dying star. Security guards were stationed at every entrance now, keeping both reporters and angry investors at bay. "There's more," David continued, turning to the final section of the report. "She's been stealing from the family's charitable foundation. Small amounts over 3 years, but it totals nearly $200,000, all transferred to personal accounts in Hong Kong. The theft was almost poetic in its significance. Sohra had looked at Malika and seen a criminal, someone who didn't belong in polite society. Meanwhile, she'd been systematically embezzling from causes designed to help underprivileged children. "When do we release this?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. Malika's timing was always perfect, calculated for maximum impact and minimum recovery time. "Tomorrow morning. Let it coincide with the quarterly earnings report Minjun Electronics is legally required to publish. Let the markets see their plummeting finances and Sohra's criminal background simultaneously." The afternoon light was fading, painting the office in shades of gold and amber. Soon, the city would light up with neon signs and electronic billboards, millions of pixels creating the illusion of prosperity while real power moved in shadows. Malika stood and walked to her window, gazing down at the street where ordinary people hurried home to families and dreams that didn't require lies to sustain them. She thought of her 8-year-old self, abandoned and terrified, but still believing that truth mattered more than comfort. "Some secrets kill slowly," she murmured to David, "but others explode all at once, taking everything with them." Tomorrow, Seoul would wake to discover that the woman who'd attacked Malika Davenport wasn't just a racist. She was a criminal, a fraud, and a thief. The court of public opinion would deliver its verdict swiftly and without mercy. The Korea Business Daily hit newsstands at 5:30 a.m. with a headline that stopped traffic. "Chaebol wife secret past. Degree fraud, hostess background, foundation theft exposed." By 6 a.m., every major television network in Seoul was running the story. Yoon Sora's world collapsed over her morning coffee. The woman who had spent 7 years crafting an image of refined sophistication watched her fabricated identity disintegrate on live television. The university degree prominently displayed in her living room was revealed as worthless paper. Her claims of aristocratic breeding were exposed as carefully constructed lies. "Turn it off!" she screamed at the maid, but the damage was already cascading through social media. Fake degree and hostess to chaebol were trending on Twitter. Her photograph, the one from their wedding announcement 7 years ago, was being shared with captions that ranged from mockery to outright disgust. At Minjun Electronics headquarters, the emergency board meeting had been going for 4 hours. The quarterly earnings report showed catastrophic losses, but the real crisis was reputational. Their CEO's wife had been exposed as a fraud, and the board was demanding his immediate resignation. "This brings dishonor to the entire company," declared Chairman Lee, his voice shaking with rage. "How can we conduct business with international partners when our leadership is associated with such scandal?" Minjun's hands trembled as he scrolled through his phone, watching their stock price crater in real time. Down 57% from yesterday's open. Financial analysts were calling it one of the fastest corporate collapses in Korean history. Across the city, Malika sat in her hotel suite's breakfast room, methodically working through her morning routine while monitoring the news coverage. The Korean media had picked up the story with the enthusiasm of sharks detecting blood in the water. "The foundation theft is getting the most coverage," David reported, settling into the chair across from her. "Stealing money meant for underprivileged children while calling someone else a criminal. The irony isn't lost on the press." The television showed footage of angry protesters outside Minjun Electronics headquarters. Signs reading, "Justice for Malika" and "End chaebol racism" bobbed above a crowd that was growing larger by the hour. "What's the financial impact of this phase?" Malika asked, cutting into her perfectly prepared breakfast with surgical precision. "Stock price is approaching penny status. 3 more major clients canceled contracts overnight. The bank consortium that backs their operations called an emergency meeting for this afternoon." David's tablet showed real-time market data that told the story of an empire in freefall. Malika nodded, watching the news coverage with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of consequence. This wasn't revenge, it was education. A masterclass in why racism always carried a price, whether paid immediately or with interest compounded over time. Her phone rang. Park Ji-hwan, the matriarch of the family, calling for the first time since the incident. Malika let it ring twice before answering, her voice professional and courteous. "Mrs. Park, how may I help you?" "We need to talk," the elderly woman replied in accented but precise English. "What my daughter-in-law did was inexcusable. What you're doing in response, perhaps we can find a solution that doesn't destroy everything." Malika smiled, watching protesters march past Minjun Electronics on the television screen. "Solutions require acknowledgement of the problem, Mrs. Park. Your family has had 48 hours to make that acknowledgement. Instead, you've remained silent while the consequences multiply." The conversation would be brief, but crucial. The old matriarch understood power in ways her daughter-in-law never could. The question was whether she understood it well enough to salvage anything from the wreckage of her family's reputation. But first, Seoul needed to see the full price of casual racism played out in market caps and criminal investigations. Sometimes education required public examples, and Sora had volunteered herself as the perfect case study. The emergency meeting in the Minjun Electronics boardroom lasted 18 minutes. 18 minutes to dismantle a man's life's work, reduce his legacy to a liability, and strip him of the only identity he'd ever known. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties," announced Chairman Lee, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "The board has voted no confidence. Your wife's scandal has made your position untenable." Minjun stared at the mahogany table where he'd once commanded respect from Korea's business elite. The same men who had bowed to him just 72 hours ago now avoided his eyes, their discomfort palpable in the silence that followed his professional execution. "I built this company," he whispered, his voice breaking on words that had once been a source of pride. 23 years of 18-hour days, of sacrificing everything for growth, for innovation. "You built it on relationships we can no longer maintain," Director Kim replied coldly. "The Americans won't deal with us. The Europeans are asking questions. Even our domestic partners are reconsidering their positions." The financial newspapers spread across the conference table told the story in stark numbers. Stock price, down 63%. Credit rating, suspended pending review. Government contracts, frozen indefinitely. Market capitalization, evaporating in real time. At the Four Seasons Hotel, Malika received the news with the same expression she might reserve for a weather update. David delivered the report while she reviewed architectural plans for a new factory in Ghana, life continuing to move forward while others' worlds collapsed. Minjun has been removed from all corporate positions. The board is desperately trying to distance themselves from the family scandal. Trading has been suspended twice today due to volatility. Malika nodded, making notes in the margin of the factory blueprints. And Sohra. Complete social exile. Her phone has been disconnected. The servants were dismissed this morning. Even her hairdresser is refusing appointments. David's report contained a note of something that might have been sympathy, if not for the memory of that slap echoing through the Shilla Hotel ballroom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hotel suite's floor-to-ceiling windows. Seoul stretched below them like a game board, where pieces were being systematically removed from play. Each building represented someone's ambition, but only a few housed the kind of power that could survive a coordinated assault. What about the criminal investigation into the foundation theft? Malika asked, her tone conversational despite the gravity of the topic. The prosecutor's office opened a formal inquiry this morning. Financial forensics teams are auditing 3 years of records. If they find what we found... David paused, consulting his tablet. She's looking at minimum 2 years in prison, maximum 5. The mathematics of consequence were playing out exactly as Malika had calculated. Pride had prevented immediate apology, which had allowed time for deeper investigation, which had revealed criminal activity, which had triggered legal consequences that no amount of social privilege could deflect. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lee Sang-woo. Minjun is trying to schedule a press conference. Claims he wants to clear the air and restore honor to the family name. Will you comment? Malika typed her response with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing crisis communications. Some stains can't be cleaned, only acknowledged. The press conference would be a disaster. Minjun's desperation would manifest as arrogance. His fear would masquerade as righteous indignation. The Korean public, already outraged by Sohra's racism and fraud, would see through his performance instantly. But perhaps that was exactly what Seoul needed. A final demonstration that privilege without accountability was just another form of criminal behavior, dressed in expensive suits and defended with borrowed authority. The city lights were beginning to flicker on as afternoon faded into evening. Soon, millions of people would be watching their televisions, witnessing the complete collapse of a family that had once seemed untouchable. The lesson would be clear. In the modern world, respect couldn't be inherited, demanded, or stolen. It could only be earned through the daily choice to treat others with the dignity every human deserved. The University of Southern California's official statement arrived via email at 11:43 a.m. Seoul time, copied to every major news outlet in Korea and the United States. The message was brief, professional, and devastating. USC has no record of Yoon Sohra attending our institution at any time. Any diploma bearing our seal and presented by this individual is fraudulent. Soh read the statement on her laptop screen from the bedroom of their Gangnam penthouse, her world shrinking to the size of a computer monitor. The diploma that had hung in their living room for 7 years, the cornerstone of her fabricated intellectual credibility, was being photographed by forensics experts as evidence in a criminal fraud investigation. "Pack only what you need," Minjun told her, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "The bank is seizing the apartment tomorrow. The cars are already gone." She stared at him, unable to process the complete reversal of their circumstances. 72 hours ago, she had commanded respect from Seoul's most powerful families. Now she was a fugitive from her own life, watching movers inventory their possessions for public auction. "This is temporary," she insisted, her voice carrying the desperate certainty of someone watching their constructed reality collapse. "Once the investigation clears up the misunderstanding about the foundation money—" "There is no misunderstanding," Minjun snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "You stole from children's charities to buy designer handbags. You built our entire marriage on lies about your education, your background, your character." The morning news played silently on their bedroom television, showing aerial footage of protesters outside USC's Seoul campus. Students held signs reading, "Education isn't for sale, and honor matters," their young faces bright with the righteousness of people who had earned their degrees honestly. Across the city, Malika stood before her bathroom mirror, preparing for what would be her first public appearance since the incident at the Shilla Hotel. Her reflection showed no trace of the violence inflicted upon her. The bruise had faded, leaving only the memory of impact and the crystal clarity of purpose it had triggered. "The prosecutor wants to meet with you this afternoon," David reported from the bedroom, his voice carrying the weight of legal machinery grinding into motion. "They're building a case that extends beyond simple document fraud into identity theft, tax evasion, and organized deception." Malika nodded, selecting a navy blue suit that projected authority without aggression. Today's testimony would be crucial not just for the criminal case, but for the broader message about accountability and consequence. "What's the family's response to the USC statement?" she asked, already knowing the answer but needing confirmation. Complete denial followed by frantic backtracking. Soh is claiming the diploma was a replica, meant to honor the education she would have received if circumstances had been different. The lawyer who prepared that statement has since withdrawn from the case. The prosecutor's office occupied 6 floors of a glass tower in Yunggu, its sterile efficiency a stark contrast to the emotional chaos swirling around the Park family collapse. Malika entered the building escorted by security, her presence drawing stares from every direction. The lead prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and rimless glasses, reviewed the evidence with methodical precision. Bank records showing systematic theft, employment documents revealing the hostess background Soh had desperately tried to hide, immigration records proving she had never traveled to the United States for education. "The degree fraud is actually our strongest charge," the prosecutor explained, spreading documents across her desk like a card sharp revealing a winning hand. "Korean law treats educational fraud as a serious crime because it undermines the entire merit-based system our society depends on." Malika provided her testimony with clinical precision, describing not just the physical assault, but the broader pattern of prejudice and entitlement that had led to it. The prosecution team took notes, their faces reflecting the satisfaction of lawyers building an airtight case. Outside, Seoul continued its daily rhythm, millions of people commuting to jobs they had earned through legitimate qualifications. But in prosecutors' offices and newsrooms throughout the city, the machinery of justice was processing a lesson about the cost of living lies, and the price of attacking someone who possessed the power to expose every fabrication you had ever constructed to protect yourself from the truth. The call came at 2:17 a.m. David's voice cut through Malika's sleep with news that changed everything. Soh is in the hospital. Suicide attempt. Overdose of sleeping pills mixed with alcohol. She's stable, but... His pause carried the weight of consequences suddenly made flesh and blood. Malika sat up in her hotel bed, the Seoul skyline glittering beyond her windows like a circuit board of ambition and desperation. For the first time in 4 days, her certainty wavered. The war she had declared against racism and entitlement had claimed its first casualty, and victory suddenly tasted like ash. "What's her condition?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil building in her chest. "Critical but stable. They pumped her stomach at Samsung Medical Center. Minjun is with her along with his mother. The media is calling it a breakdown from public shame." David's report carried an undertone of judgment that Malika couldn't quite interpret. She rose and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Somewhere in this city, a woman lay in a hospital bed because the truth had proven more unbearable than death. The symmetry was brutal. Soh had tried to destroy Malika with a single slap, and Malika had responded by systematically dismantling every lie that held her enemy's identity together. "Are you having second thoughts?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. He had been with Malika long enough to recognize the signs of moral calculation, the precise moment when strategy collided with conscience. Second thoughts about what? About refusing to accept racism? About demanding accountability for criminal behavior? About insisting that actions have consequences? Her words carried conviction, but the edge was softer than it had been yesterday. The morning news would be brutal. Chaebol wife, attempts suicide after fraud exposure. The story would pivot from justice to tragedy, from accountability to cruelty. Public opinion, so firmly in Malika's corner just hours ago, would begin to shift toward sympathy for the woman who had nearly died from shame. "The prosecutor wants to know if you'll be available for additional testimony," David continued. "The criminal investigation will continue regardless of Soh's condition, but they're concerned about public perception." Malika understood the calculation. Living criminals could be prosecuted, but dead ones became martyrs. Soh's attempted suicide had transformed her from perpetrator to victim in the court of public opinion, and that shift would complicate everything. "Schedule a meeting with Park Ji-hwan," Malika decided, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never backed down from a difficult decision. It's time the matriarch and I had a direct conversation about responsibility, consequence, and the difference between justice and revenge. The hospital room would be sterile and white, surrounded by the mechanical sounds of machines monitoring a life that had nearly ended rather than face its own failures. Minjun would be there, his arrogance finally stripped away to reveal the frightened man beneath. And Soh would lie unconscious, her racism and fraud having led her to the edge of existence itself. But Malika had learned long ago that power came with responsibility. Not just the responsibility to punish wrongdoing, but to know when punishment had achieved its purpose. The question facing her now wasn't whether Soh deserved what had happened to her. The question was whether justice required mercy, or whether mercy was simply another word for enabling the kind of behavior that led to racial slurs in hotel ballrooms. The city lights blurred through the window as dawn approached Seoul, bringing with it a day that would test whether the most feared woman in American business was strong enough to show the compassion that true power made possible, or whether the little girl abandoned at a Detroit bus station still demanded that everyone who hurt her pay the full price for their cruelty. Park Minjun looked like he had aged 10 years in 5 days. His usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated into wrinkled shirts and day-old stubble. His Patek Philippe watch replaced by a basic timepiece he'd bought at a convenience store after selling everything of value to pay legal fees. He waited in the Four Seasons lobby like a supplicant seeking audience with royalty. his hands shaking slightly as he rehearsed the words that would either save his family or confirm their complete destruction. The hotel staff recognized him from the news coverage, their expressions mixing professional courtesy with barely concealed contempt. Malika kept him waiting exactly 37 minutes, long enough to understand his desperation, short enough to avoid cruelty. When she finally appeared, descending the marble staircase like a general accepting surrender, Minjun felt his remaining pride crumble completely. "Mr. Park," she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy of someone addressing a stranger. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." They moved to a private dining room, its windows offering a view of Seoul that Minjun no longer felt he belonged to. The city that had once celebrated his success now bore witness to his systematic humiliation. "My wife is fighting for her life," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors say the combination of medication and alcohol could have killed her. She's been asking for you, begging for the chance to apologize properly." Malika sat across from him, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. Apologize for what, specifically? For the racism, the fraud, the theft from children's charities, or for the fact that she got caught? The questions hit like physical blows. Minjun's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass, the simple motion requiring tremendous effort. For all of it, she knows she was wrong, completely wrong. The things she said, the assumptions she made. "She called me a criminal while stealing money meant for underprivileged children," Malika interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut. "She told me to know my place while living a complete fabrication of educational and social credentials. She slapped me in public because she thought my skin color made me inferior to her." Each accusation landed with surgical precision, stripping away any possibility of minimizing what had actually occurred. This wasn't a cultural misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was systematic prejudice backed by criminal behavior. "I'm begging you," Minjun said, the words physically painful to speak. "Not for me, not for our company, but for her life. End this persecution. Accept her apology. Let us rebuild with dignity." Malika studied the man across from her, seeing the complete collapse of arrogance into desperation. This was the moment she had been building toward. The precise instant when power revealed its true nature through the choice between justice and mercy. "You want mercy," she said finally. "But mercy requires acknowledgement, not just of what happened, but of why it happened. Your wife didn't attack me because of stress or alcohol or momentary judgment. She attacked me because she believed her race made her superior to mine." The dining room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of Seoul traffic 40 floors below. Minjun's breathing was shallow, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. "What would acknowledgement look like?" he asked, though he suspected the price would be higher than anything he could afford. Malika leaned forward slightly, her presence commanding even in negotiation. Public testimony about systematic racism in Chaebol culture. Financial restitution to organizations fighting discrimination. Personal accountability, not just from Sora, but from you, for enabling her behavior. The terms weren't a negotiation, they were a verdict. Minjun could accept them and salvage some fragment of dignity, or reject them and watch his family name disappear completely into legal proceedings and public scorn. "And if I agree to all of that," he asked, his voice hollow with defeat, "you'll call off the investigation?" Malika's smile was sharp as winter morning. "Mr. Park, I never called any investigation on. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. Justice doesn't sleep because you finally decided to wake up." The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like surrender documents being signed. Minjun left understanding that mercy, when it came, would be earned through years of public accountability, not purchased with a single moment of private humiliation. The conference room at Hana Bank felt like a funeral parlor, its mahogany table surrounded by men in black suits delivering death sentences with actuarial precision. Minjun sat at the far end, his lawyers flanking him like mourners at a service for his financial life. Effective immediately, all credit lines are frozen, announced Director Song, his voice carrying the institutional authority of Korean banking. The collateral securing your loans has been compromised by contract cancellations. Our risk assessment department classifies Minjun Electronics as insolvent. The document spread across the table told the story in stark mathematical terms. $2 billion in debt, secured against contracts that no longer existed, backed by a reputation that had become toxic. The numbers added up to commercial extinction. "We've been banking partners for 15 years, Minjun protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "Surely there's some accommodation, some bridge financing until the situation stabilizes." Director Song's expression remained unchanged, professional courtesy masking institutional ruthlessness. "Mr. Park, your wife's criminal activities have triggered compliance reviews throughout the financial sector. No major bank in Korea will extend credit to your family or associated entities." Across Seoul, the financial contagion spread with viral efficiency. KB Kookmin Bank, Shinhan Bank, Wori Bank, each institution that had once competed for Minjun's business, now rushed to distance themselves from his collapsing empire. The word untouchable carried new meaning in Korean banking circles. At the Four Seasons Hotel, Malika monitored the systematic financial strangulation, with the detachment of a surgeon observing a necessary amputation. The Korean banking system was responding exactly as she had predicted, with the cold logic of risk management and the institutional memory of previous chaebol collapses. KB Kookmin just announced they're accelerating repayment schedules for all Park family-related loans, David reported, scrolling through financial news feeds. They're citing material adverse change clauses to demand immediate settlement of outstanding balances. The dominoes were falling in predetermined sequence. Credit freeze led to cash flow crisis, which triggered accelerated payment demands, which exposed the fundamental insolvency that had been masked by leveraging and cross guarantees. "What's the cascade timeline for their suppliers?" Malika asked, her voice clinical despite the human drama unfolding across the city. "The electronics component manufacturers will be hit within 48 hours. Most of them extended credit terms based on Minjun's banking relationships. Without those guarantees..." David paused, calculating. "We estimate 16 companies will face liquidity crises by week's end." The mathematical beauty of modern finance was revealing itself through destruction. Each connection in the supply chain that had once strengthened Minjun's position now became a vector for transmitting financial disease. Trust, built over decades, evaporated in hours. Minjun's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from suppliers demanding immediate payment, from employees asking about their jobs, from investors wondering if their money would ever be seen again. Each conversation was a small funeral for relationships that had defined his business identity. "The China Development Bank is asking questions about loan guarantees," his chief financial officer reported during an emergency call. "If they discover the collateral has been compromised, they'll trigger default clauses on the $2 billion credit facility." The Chinese connection was the final nail. Minjun had leveraged his Korean assets to secure mainland Chinese financing, believing his domestic success was permanent and unassailable. That confidence was now being measured in percentage points of delinquency rates and risk assessments. Director Song closed the meeting with bureaucratic efficiency. will need possession of all company assets by tomorrow morning. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal proceedings for recovery of outstanding balances. Minjun left the bank, understanding that his business obituary was being written in real time by credit analysts and risk managers across Seoul's financial district. The empire he had built through 23 years of 18-hour days would be liquidated by spreadsheet calculations and banking regulations. But somewhere in the city, Malika Davenport continued her morning routine, knowing that true power in the modern economy wasn't inherited or demanded. It was earned through the daily choice to build systems strong enough to survive any storm, and principled enough to weather any crisis. Park Ji-hwan had lived through the Korean War, witnessed the country's transformation from agricultural poverty to technological superpower, and survived 3 major economic crises. But nothing had prepared her for the conversation she was about to have in the sterile hospital corridor outside her daughter-in-law's room. The 70-year-old matriarch stood perfectly erect despite her carved wooden cane, her traditional hanbok a study in understated elegance. Behind her, through the glass window, Soh lay unconscious, her face pale against white hospital linens, machines monitoring the life she had nearly thrown away. "Mrs. Park," Malika said, approaching with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of this moment. The 2 women faced each other in the hallway, one representing old Korea's rigid hierarchies, the other embodying new power structures that transcended traditional boundaries. "Miss Davenport." Ji-hwan's English was accented but precise, each word chosen with diplomatic care. "I have come to discuss the terms of my family's surrender." The word choice was intentional, carrying the weight of military strategy and historical precedent. In Korean culture, admitting defeat required specific protocols, particular language that acknowledged not just failure, but the reasons for that failure. They moved to a private consultation room, its neutral decor offering no distractions from the conversation that would determine whether the Park family retained any fragment of dignity or disappeared entirely into legal proceedings and public disgrace. "My daughter-in-law is a fool," Ji-hwan stated without preamble. "Worse, she is a criminal and a liar who has brought shame to 4 generations of family honor. But my son enabled her behavior, and I remained silent when I should have spoken." Malika studied the older woman, recognizing the courage it took for someone raised in Korea's Confucian hierarchy to accept responsibility for family failures. This wasn't just personal accountability, it was cultural revolution. "What kind of accountability are you prepared to accept?" Malika asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had moved beyond anger into strategic thinking. Ji-hwan reached into her handbag and withdrew a leather portfolio, its contents representing the last vestiges of family wealth. "Our personal holdings, the ancestral home in Andong, my late husband's art collection, the family foundation's remaining assets, everything that exists independent of the company structure." The offer was staggering. Ji-hwan was proposing to liquidate 4 centuries of family accumulation to pay for her daughter-in-law's racism and her son's complicity. "And in return?" Malika asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Protection for the family name, legal intervention to prevent criminal charges, the opportunity for my son to rebuild with dignity rather than starting from prison." Ji-hwan's voice carried the pragmatic calculation of someone who understood that survival sometimes required sacrificing everything to preserve what mattered most. Malika walked to the window, gazing out at Seoul's afternoon skyline. Below, millions of people continued their daily lives, most of them unaware that the conversation happening in this hospital room would determine whether justice meant punishment or transformation. "Your proposal assumes I want your money," she said finally. "But I've never been motivated by wealth, Mrs. Park. I'm motivated by change. Permanent, structural change that prevents other people from experiencing what I experienced in that ballroom. Ji-hwan nodded slowly, recognizing the deeper negotiation taking place. Then what would satisfy your definition of justice? Public acknowledgement of systemic racism in chaebol culture, educational initiatives funded by your family's assets, personal testimony from Minjun about the attitudes that enabled Sora's behavior, and most importantly, a commitment to using whatever influence you retain to change how Korean business treats people who don't fit traditional expectations. The terms weren't financial, they were transformational. Malika was proposing to turn the Park family's destruction into a catalyst for broader social evolution. Ji-hwan considered the proposal with the methodical thinking that had preserved her family through 7 decades of Korean history. And if we agree to these terms, you'll use your influence to prevent my daughter-in-law's imprisonment? I'll use my influence to ensure the justice system focuses on education rather than punishment. But Mrs. Park, your daughter-in-law's freedom will depend on her own willingness to change, not on any protection I might provide. The afternoon sun painted golden rectangles across the consultation room floor as 2 women from different worlds negotiated the price of transformation. Outside, Seoul pulsed with the energy of a society in constant motion, change and tradition locked in eternal dialogue. Ji-hwan extended her hand, the gesture carrying centuries of Korean diplomatic tradition. Then we have an understanding, Miss Davenport. My family's honor will be rebuilt through service to justice, not protected through privilege. The handshake sealed more than an agreement. It marked the moment when Korea's old power structure acknowledged the emergence of something new, something that couldn't be contained by traditional hierarchies or conventional expectations. The private jet sat on the tarmac at Gimpo International Airport, like a silver promise of escape, its engines warming under the pre-dawn darkness. Minjun had liquidated his last personal assets to charter the flight to Singapore, where numbered bank accounts and diplomatic immunity might offer refuge from the storm destroying his life. "Passports, sir," the flight attendant requested, her professional smile masking awareness of the drama surrounding her passengers. Behind Minjun, Sora moved like a ghost, her face still bearing the pallor of someone who had nearly chosen death over disgrace. The passport scan triggered an alert that would cascade through Korea's integrated security systems within 90 seconds. Immigration authorities, already monitoring the Park family due to pending criminal investigations, immediately flagged the attempted departure. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're experiencing technical difficulties with our departure clearance," the pilot announced over the intercom, his voice carrying professional regret that masked legal obligation. "Please remain seated while we resolve the issue with air traffic control." 3 black sedans approached the aircraft with the coordinated precision of law enforcement operations. Minjun watched through his window as uniformed officers surrounded the plane, their presence transforming his escape route into a trap. Across the city, Malika received the news while reviewing morning intelligence reports in her hotel suite. The attempted flight represented either desperation or arrogance, possibly both, but it certainly demonstrated that the Park family still failed to understand the scope of consequences they faced. "Immigration stopped them 20 minutes before takeoff," David reported, scrolling through official notifications on his secure tablet. Sora's passport was already flagged due to the criminal investigation. Minjun's was flagged when he purchased the charter flight using funds that should have been frozen pending asset recovery proceedings. The mathematics of modern surveillance made escape nearly impossible for people whose lives had been dissected by financial investigators and criminal prosecutors. Every transaction, every movement, every communication left digital fingerprints that could be traced and predicted. "What's the legal implication of attempted flight?" Malika asked, though she already knew the answer would complicate any potential negotiation with Park Ji-hwan. Consciousness of guilt. The prosecution can argue that attempting to flee the country demonstrates awareness of criminal liability. It undermines any defense strategy based on claiming ignorance or cultural misunderstanding. David's legal analysis was clinical, but accurate. Sohra had remained silent throughout the airport ordeal, her earlier suicide attempt having stripped away the arrogance that had once defined her personality. Now she sat in an interrogation room at Gimpo police station, staring at handcuffs that represented the final collapse of her carefully constructed identity. "We were going to Singapore for medical treatment," Minjun lied to investigators, his desperation obvious to everyone in the room. "My wife's condition requires specialized therapy that isn't available in Korea." The lie was transparent and desperate. Medical records from Samsung Medical Center clearly showed Sohra's condition was stable and required only standard psychiatric follow-up. The private jet's flight plan had listed final destination as the Cayman Islands, not Singapore. Detective Lee Sang-min, who had spent 15 years investigating white-collar crime, recognized the pattern of wealthy defendants who believed money could purchase immunity from consequence. "Mr. Park, your wife is facing criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Your company is under investigation for tax evasion and labor violations. Attempting to flee the jurisdiction suggests you have something to hide." The interrogation room's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across Minjun's face, aging him beyond his years. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and influenced government policy now sat across from a civil servant who earned in a year what Minjun had once spent on a single watch. "I want to call my lawyer," Minjun said, invoking his constitutional rights with the desperation of someone who finally understood that privilege had limits. But lawyers required retainers, and retainers required unfrozen bank accounts. And unfrozen bank accounts required cooperation with authorities who had every reason to treat attempted flight as evidence of guilt. The circular logic of legal consequence was tightening around the Park family like a financial noose. At her hotel suite, Malika considered the morning's developments with strategic detachment. The attempted escape had eliminated any possibility of negotiated resolution. The Park family had just demonstrated that they preferred flight to accountability, self-preservation to justice. "Cancel my meeting with Park Ji-hwan," she instructed David. Her son and daughter-in-law just chose to be fugitives rather than face the consequences of their actions. The time for negotiation has ended. The morning sun rose over Seoul, illuminating a city where justice moved with the inexorable certainty of digital surveillance and international law enforcement cooperation. In the modern economy, there were no safe havens for people who mistook privilege for immunity or racism for acceptable behavior. The law office of Kim and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Gangnam. Its marble lobby designed to project the kind of institutional authority that commanded premium rates from desperate clients. Park Ji-hwan entered alone, her carved wooden cane clicking against polished stone as she approached the receptionist. "I need to speak with senior partner Kim immediately," she said, her voice carrying the imperious tone of someone accustomed to having requests treated as commands. "It concerns the Park family matter." Behind mahogany doors, emergency strategy sessions had been running for 18 hours straight. Korea's most expensive legal talent was discovering that money couldn't solve problems rooted in criminal behavior, public outrage, and systematic financial collapse. The attempted flight destroyed any possibility of plea bargaining, explained attorney Kim Jung-ho, his expression grave as he reviewed case files that read like a catalog of white-collar crime. "The prosecution now views your family as flight risks with consciousness of guilt." Ji-hwan studied the legal documents spread across the conference table. Criminal charges, civil asset forfeiture proceedings, tax investigations, labor violations. Each page represented another avenue through which the Korean legal system could dismantle what remained of her family's legacy. "What are our options?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be limited and expensive. "Cooperation. Complete, voluntary, transparent cooperation with all ongoing investigations. Your son's testimony about Chibal business practices, your daughter-in-law's admission of guilt, full financial disclosure, and restitution for all damages." Attorney Kim's proposal was surrender disguised as strategy. Across Seoul, Malika sat in the prosecutor's office, providing supplementary testimony that would ensure the criminal case proceeded without political interference or chaebol influence. Her presence legitimized the investigation, while her international business relationships provided alternative sources for evidence that Korean authorities might struggle to obtain independently. Mrs. Yoon's educational fraud extends beyond the USC diploma, Prosecutor Han explained, referencing Sohra by her maiden name as if the Park family marriage had been dissolved by criminal proceedings. "We've discovered forged certificates from 3 other institutions, falsified employment records, and systematically fraudulent tax filings dating back 7 years. The pattern was comprehensive and deliberate. Sohra hadn't committed isolated acts of deception. She had constructed an entirely fictional biography, supported by criminal document forgery and financial manipulation. Her attack on Malika had simply been the moment when her fabricated superiority collided with genuine power." "What's the timeline for formal charges?" Malika asked, her voice professional, despite personal investment in seeing justice served. "The grand jury will hear evidence next week. Given the documentation we've assembled, indictments are virtually certain. The question isn't whether she'll be charged, it's whether she'll cooperate or force a public trial that exposes even more family secrets." At Kim & Associates, Ji-hwan was learning that legal representation couldn't restore reputation or reverse financial ruin. The best her lawyers could offer was damage mitigation through strategic surrender and public contrition. "The media coverage has shifted public opinion against your family," Attorney Kim admitted reluctantly. Initial sympathy for Sohra's suicide attempt has been replaced by outrage over the scale of her deception. A public trial would be devastating for everyone involved. The afternoon shadows stretched across Gangnam as Ji-hwan contemplated the complete collapse of everything her family had built over 4 generations. The ancestral home in Andong, the art collection, the business relationships, the social standing, all of it would be sacrificed to pay for her daughter-in-law's moment of racist arrogance. "Draft the cooperation agreement," she instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Full disclosure, complete restitution, public apology, whatever it takes to preserve something of the family name for future generations." The decision was surrender, but surrender with dignity rather than destruction through public trial and media spectacle. Ji-hwan understood that survival sometimes required sacrificing everything to preserve the possibility of eventual redemption. Attorney Kim nodded gravely, already calculating the years of legal work required to negotiate plea agreements, asset forfeiture settlements, and civil restitution claims. The Park family's last resort was becoming Korea's most expensive legal surrender. But across the city, in prosecutors' offices and newsrooms, the machinery of justice continued grinding forward with institutional inevitability. Some lessons could only be learned through complete accountability, and Sohra's racism had triggered consequences that would reshape how Korean society viewed both privilege and prejudice. The Samsung Medical Center's psychiatric wing hummed with the quiet efficiency of institutional healing, its sterile corridors lined with rooms where broken minds sought repair. In room 312, Sohra sat by her window, staring out at Seoul's sprawling cityscape while contemplating the ruins of the life she had built on lies. Dr. Sarah Choi had been treating her for 6 days, working through layers of psychological defense that had protected Sohra's fabricated identity for over a decade. The breakthrough had come during their 4th session, when the carefully constructed persona finally collapsed under the weight of undeniable evidence. "You created an entire fictional biography," Dr. Choi observed, her voice carrying professional compassion despite the criminal nature of her patient's deceptions. University education, family background, employment history, all of it designed to justify feelings of superiority over others. Sohra's reflection in the hospital window showed a woman stripped of pretense, her designer clothes replaced by hospital gowns, her carefully styled hair hanging limp and unwashed. The external markers of status that had once defined her identity were gone, leaving only the person she had spent years trying to escape. "I wasn't born into money," she whispered, her voice cracking on words she had never spoken aloud. "My father sold fish at Noryangjin Market. My mother cleaned offices at night. We lived in a one-room apartment in Uido until I was 16. The poverty she described was the reality that Sohra's racist attack on Malika had tried to deny. The understanding that circumstances of birth didn't determine human worth, that dignity couldn't be inherited, that respect had to be earned regardless of skin color or family background. Across the city, Malika met with Lee Sang-woo for what would be their final interview before the criminal trial began. The journalist had been documenting the case with meticulous attention to detail, understanding that the story would become a landmark examination of racism, privilege, and accountability in modern Korea. "Do you feel any responsibility for Sohra's suicide attempt?" Sang-woo asked, his digital recorder capturing every nuance of Malika's response. "I feel responsible for ensuring that racism has consequences," she replied, her voice steady despite the complexity of emotions the question triggered. Sohra's choice to nearly end her life rather than face those consequences reflects her own psychological relationship with truth and accountability. The hospital room had become a laboratory for examining the psychology of prejudice. Dr. Choi was documenting how fabricated superiority could trigger desperate measures when confronted with authentic power from unexpected sources. "When you saw Malika Davenport at the hotel," Dr. Choi asked during their session, "what did you assume about her? That she was nobody important. That she was there to serve people like me. That her skin color meant she couldn't possibly have the kind of power that mattered in our world." Sohra's admissions were painful but necessary, each word stripping away another layer of psychological defense. The racist assumptions were textbook examples of how prejudice functioned, not as logical assessment, but as emotional protection for people whose own identity required the devaluation of others. Sohra had needed to believe in racial hierarchy, because her fabricated biography couldn't withstand comparison with genuine achievement. "What changed when you learned who she really was?" Dr. Choi continued, her therapeutic process designed to help Sohra understand the connection between her actions and their consequences. Terror. Complete terror. Because if someone like her could have that kind of power, then everything I believed about the world was wrong. Every assumption I'd made about who mattered and who didn't was a lie. The breakthrough was visible in real time. Years of defensive psychology crumbling in a hospital room. At the Four Seasons, Malika reviewed medical reports that had been submitted as part of Sohra's legal defense strategy. The psychiatric evaluation would be used to argue for reduced sentencing based on psychological instability, but it also provided insight into the mindset that had triggered the entire crisis. "She's requesting a personal meeting with you," David reported, reviewing legal correspondence from Sohra's defense team. The psychiatrist believes a direct apology might be therapeutically beneficial for her recovery process. Malika considered the request with strategic detachment. The meeting would be used by defense lawyers to demonstrate Sohra's remorse and psychological progress, potentially influencing sentencing decisions. But it would also provide an opportunity to deliver a final lesson about the real costs of racism. Schedule it for tomorrow afternoon, she decided, understanding that justice sometimes required bearing witness to the human cost of the consequences she had triggered. But make it clear that this meeting is about accountability, not absolution. The city lights were beginning to flicker on as evening approached Seoul. Millions of people returning home to families and dreams that didn't require lies to sustain them. In hospitals and law offices throughout the city, the final chapters of the Park family saga were being written by psychiatrists and prosecutors who understood that some lessons could only be learned through complete psychological and financial collapse. The hospital meeting room had been arranged with clinical precision. 2 chairs separated by a small table, security cameras in every corner, and a psychiatrist positioned discreetly near the door. Sohra entered first, her movements tentative and uncertain, followed by Malika, whose presence commanded the space despite its institutional neutrality. 6 days of psychiatric treatment had stripped away Sohra's defensive arrogance, leaving behind someone who looked fragile and genuinely remorseful. Her hands shook slightly as she sat down, her eyes unable to meet Malika's direct gaze. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Sohra began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve your time or your attention after what I did." Malika studied the woman across from her, noting the physical transformation that accompanied psychological breakdown. The person who had slapped her at the Shilla Hotel had been performing superiority and confidence. This person was experiencing the authentic vulnerability that came with facing truth. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" Malika asked, her voice professionally neutral. "Be specific." The question forced Sohra to confront the full scope of her actions, rather than offering generic expressions of regret. Dr. Choi had prepared her for this moment, explaining that meaningful apology required precise acknowledgement of harm caused. "I attacked you because of your skin color. I assumed you were inferior to me because you're black. I said things that were racist and cruel because I thought your race made you unworthy of respect." Each admission was physically painful for Sohra to speak, her voice breaking on words that exposed her deepest prejudices. "Continue," Malika instructed, her tone indicating that the apology was incomplete. "I built my entire identity on lies. Fake education credentials, fabricated family background, stolen money from charities. I attacked you for being what I thought was inferior while living as a complete fraud myself." The second wave of admissions was even more devastating, forcing Sohra to acknowledge the hypocrisy that had made her racism particularly offensive. Malika nodded, recognizing that the apology met professional standards for accountability and psychological authenticity. But apology was only the beginning of a conversation about justice, consequence, and the possibility of redemption. "Do you understand why you held those racist beliefs?" she asked, shifting from acknowledgement to analysis. Sohra's response revealed 6 days of intensive psychological work with Dr. Choi. "Because I needed to believe that some people were naturally inferior so I could feel superior despite my own fabricated background. Because racism gave me a hierarchy where I wasn't at the bottom, even though everything about my identity was fake." The insight was clinically accurate and personally devastating. Sohra had used racial prejudice as psychological protection from her own insecurities about class, education, and social standing. "And do you understand the full scope of consequences your actions triggered?" Malika continued, her questions designed to ensure complete understanding rather than partial accountability. "Your business decisions destroyed my husband's company, exposed my criminal activities, ruined our family's reputation, and led to criminal charges that will probably send me to prison." Sohra's summary was accurate but incomplete, focusing on personal impact rather than broader social implications. "Those aren't consequences I imposed," Malika corrected with surgical precision. those are consequences that already existed for racism, fraud, and embezzlement. I simply stopped protecting you from them. The distinction was crucial for understanding how power actually functioned in modern society. Malika hadn't created punishment. She had removed the privilege that had previously shielded Soh from the natural consequences of her own behavior. What happens now depends on your choices moving forward, Malika explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had moved beyond anger into strategic thinking. Justice doesn't require your destruction. It requires your transformation. The meeting lasted 47 minutes, ending with handshakes that carried different meanings for each participant. For Soh, it represented hope that redemption might be possible through years of genuine change. For Malika, it represented confirmation that justice could coexist with mercy when accountability was complete and authentic. But as they left the sterile hospital room and returned to Seoul's complex reality, both women understood that forgiveness was a process measured in years of changed behavior, not a single moment of sincere apology. The real test would come when Soh faced criminal sentencing and had to choose between learning from her mistakes or returning to the psychological patterns that had created them. The Seoul Central District Court's courtroom buzzed with media attention as Korea's most watched criminal trial approached its climactic moment. Soh sat beside her defense attorney, her appearance transformed by weeks of legal proceedings from entitled socialite to humbled defendant facing the consequences of systematic fraud and racism. Judge Park Sun-hee had presided over white-collar crime cases for 12 years, but never one that combined criminal fraud with racial violence in such a publicly documented manner. The evidence was overwhelming: forged diplomas, embezzled charity funds, tax evasion, and the assault on Malika Davenport that had triggered the entire investigation. The defendant has pleaded guilty to all charges, Judge Park announced to the packed courtroom. We are here today for sentencing, taking into account both the severity of the crimes and the defendant's cooperation with authorities. Malika sat in the gallery's front row, her presence a reminder that justice had human faces and personal stakes. Behind her, Korean and international journalists documented every moment of proceedings that would influence how similar cases were handled throughout Asia. Prosecutor Han delivered his sentencing recommendation with clinical precision. The defendant's crimes represent systematic deception spanning 7 years, theft from charitable organizations serving underprivileged children, and racially motivated assault against a visiting business leader. We recommend 4 years imprisonment, followed by community service focused on anti-racism education. The recommendation balanced punishment with rehabilitation, acknowledging that Soh's transformation during psychiatric treatment had been genuine while ensuring accountability for criminal behavior that had damaged Korea's international reputation. Defense attorney Lee made his final plea for judicial mercy. My client has accepted complete responsibility for her actions, undergone intensive psychological treatment, and committed to spending the remainder of her life making amends for the harm she has caused. We respectfully request suspended sentencing with mandatory community service and continued psychiatric supervision. Judge Park studied the case files one final time, her decision carrying implications beyond a single defendant's fate. Korean society was watching to see whether privilege and wealth could still purchase immunity from consequence, or whether genuine accountability was becoming the new standard. Yoon Soh, please rise for sentencing, Judge Park commanded, her voice carrying the institutional authority of Korean jurisprudence. Soh stood shakily, supported by her attorney's steadying hand. The woman who had once commanded Seoul's social scene now faced the possibility of years in prison for crimes that had seemed insignificant when committed from positions of privilege. This court finds that your crimes were not momentary lapses in judgment, but systematic patterns of deception and criminal behavior spanning nearly a decade, Judge Park began, her words carrying the weight of legal precedent that would influence future cases. However, this court also recognizes your genuine cooperation with authorities, your authentic psychological transformation, and your commitment to making restitution for the harm you have caused. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Park prepared to deliver the sentence that would define Sohra's future and establish Korea's legal response to crimes combining fraud with racial violence. You are hereby sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, suspended pending completion of 2,000 hours of community service focused on anti-racism education, full restitution of embezzled funds, and continued psychiatric treatment under court supervision. The suspended sentence represented judicial recognition that punishment without rehabilitation served neither justice nor society. Sohra would avoid prison if she demonstrated genuine change through years of supervised community service. Malika felt complex emotions as the gavel fell: satisfaction that accountability had been achieved, concern that suspended sentencing might be perceived as privilege protecting wealth, and cautious optimism that genuine transformation was possible when consequences were both certain and constructive. As reporters rushed to file stories and legal analysts debated the precedential implications, Malika understood that her work in Seoul was approaching completion. Justice had been served through legal proceedings, but lasting change would require the kind of systematic transformation that occurred through education, economic pressure, and social evolution. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the lessons would resonate through Korean society for years to come. Racism would never again be dismissed as cultural misunderstanding when it carried criminal penalties and economic consequences. And privilege would never again provide immunity from accountability when authentic power demanded justice. 6 months after the sentencing, Malika stood before an audience of 500 Korean business leaders in the same Shilla Hotel ballroom, where Sohra had made her fatal mistake. The golden chandeliers cast the same elegant light, but everything else had fundamentally changed. Power without accountability is just another form of corruption, she told the gathering of CEOs, government ministers, and chaebol heirs who had come to hear the woman who had redefined consequence in Korean business culture. And accountability without power is just another form of performance. The irony was intentional and precise. She was delivering a keynote address about business ethics in the exact location where racism had triggered the systematic destruction of a family empire. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. David Chen sat in the front row, monitoring social media feeds that showed overwhelming public support for Malika's message. The hashtag #JarinPowerMeetsJustice was trending across Asia, with business schools from Tokyo to Singapore incorporating the Park family case study into their ethics curricula. The question isn't whether racism exists in international business, Malika continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. The question is whether business leaders have the courage to create systems that make racism economically impossible to sustain. In the audience, Park Ji-hwan listened with the attention of someone whose family had learned this lesson through complete financial and social collapse. The elderly matriarch now served on the advisory board of the Korea Business Ethics Foundation, her personal experience providing credibility to anti-discrimination initiatives. Sohra was not present. She was completing her community service at a multicultural education center in Itaewon, teaching Korean language classes to African immigrants while attending weekly psychiatric sessions. Her transformation appeared genuine, but proof would come through years of sustained changed behavior. When someone attacks another person because of their race, Malika explained to the attentive audience, they're not just committing an act of individual prejudice. They're challenging the fundamental principle that business success should be based on merit, innovation, and value creation, rather than inherited privilege or assumed superiority. The economic argument was compelling because it spoke to Korean business culture's competitive instincts. Racism wasn't just morally wrong, It was economically inefficient, wasting human talent and creating unnecessary market friction. Minjun was rebuilding his life as a mid-level manager at a telecommunications company, his previous CEO status replaced by the kind of middle management position he had once considered beneath his dignity. The work was honest, his colleagues respectful, and his paycheck sufficient for a modest life without privilege. The most powerful lesson from the Park family case, Malika told her audience, isn't about the price of racism. It's about the possibility of redemption through genuine accountability and sustained change. The rehabilitation narrative was crucial because it demonstrated that justice could coexist with mercy when consequences led to authentic transformation rather than mere punishment. After the keynote, Malika walked through Seoul's streets one final time before returning to the United States. The city that had witnessed her public humiliation 6 months earlier now honored her with respectful recognition from passers-by, who understood that real power came from principles rather than privilege. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lee Sang-woo. University business schools across Asia are teaching the Davenport Park case as required curriculum. The ripple effect continues to spread. The systemic change she had sought was becoming reality through institutional adoption of new ethical standards. Korean businesses were implementing diversity training, international partnerships were including anti-discrimination clauses, and a new generation of leaders was learning that respect couldn't be demanded or inherited, only earned through consistent demonstration of human dignity. As her flight lifted off from Incheon International Airport, Malika reflected on the lesson that had begun with a slap and ended with transformation. Power without conscience was temporary, but power guided by principle could create changes that lasted generations. Below, Seoul's light stretched to the horizon like a circuit board of ambition and possibility. Somewhere in that vast city, people of all backgrounds were pursuing dreams in an environment slightly more just than it had been 6 months earlier. The work of building equitable societies never ended, but progress was measured in moments when someone with power chose to use it for everyone's benefit rather than personal advantage. Justice hadn't required revenge. It had required the patience to teach permanent lessons about respect, dignity, and the understanding that in the modern world, true strength came from lifting others up, rather than tearing them down. The little girl abandoned at a Detroit bus station had become the woman who proved that power meant nothing without the wisdom to use it well. What would you do if you witnessed such an injustice? Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred isn't hatred in return, but the patient work of creating systems where respect and dignity become the only acceptable standards for human interaction. The morning sun painted Seoul's skyline in shades of gold and possibility as Malika's story reached its natural conclusion. Not in destruction, but in transformation. The slap that had echoed through the Shilla Hotel ballroom 6 months earlier had become the first note in a symphony of systemic change that would resonate through Korean business culture for generations. Sora's racism had triggered consequences that extended far beyond her personal destruction. Korean universities now required courses in cultural competency and business ethics. International corporations operating in Asia implemented anti-discrimination protocols inspired by the Davenport Park case. And most importantly, a new generation of business leaders learned that respect wasn't a privilege to be granted or withheld based on race, but a fundamental requirement for professional success. The Park family's financial empire was gone, dissolved into legal settlements and restitution payments that funded scholarships for underprivileged students and educational programs promoting equality in business. But the family itself survived, humbled, transformed, and committed to spending years rebuilding their reputation through service rather than privilege. Malika returned to Detroit, understanding that true power wasn't measured in the ability to destroy enemies, but in the capacity to create lasting change that prevented others from experiencing the kind of prejudice she had faced. The abandoned 8-year-old at the bus station had become the woman who proved that justice and mercy could coexist when accountability was complete and transformation was genuine. In boardrooms across Asia, executives now paused before making assumptions based on appearance or accent, knowing that underestimating someone's power could trigger consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment. The new equation was simple. Respect everyone, because you never knew who possessed the influence to hold you accountable for your choices. The story that began with casual racism in an elegant ballroom concluded with systematic change in how international business approached diversity, dignity, and the fundamental truth that human worth couldn't be determined by skin color, family background, or inherited privilege. Sometimes justice required patience, but it always demanded the courage to use power in service of principles larger than personal satisfaction. And sometimes, the most feared woman in American business was simply someone who refused to accept that racism was the price of doing business in a world where respect should be the universal currency of human interaction.